Right. Let's jump into this deep dive into Acts 8:26 to 39. You know, we all know the passage. We probably all preached on it.
Yeah.
But we wanted to bring in some different angles, some stuff that you might not have thought about before from different pastors. And we found some really interesting historical context, too. So shall we?
Let's do it.
So we've got Philip, led by the Spirit, to meet the Ethiopian eunuch who's on the road to Gaza.
Right.
And he's reading Isaiah, but he's having a little trouble understanding.
Big time.
Enter Philip. What I thought was fascinating is how many pastors are using this passage to rethink how we approach ministry altogether.
Yeah.
Like City Church Georgetown uses this to illustrate living missionally.
Yeah. They emphasize that Philip didn't create this ministry moment.
Yeah.
He joined one that God had already set in motion.
So it's less about us drumming up the opportunities and more about being attuned to where God is already working.
Exactly. It's a challenge to us, isn't it? Are we so busy building programs that we're missing those divine appointments happening all around us? Are we so focused on our agenda that we overlook the subtle ways that God is already moving?
That really makes you rethink those times that you might have forced a conversation or you tried to manufacture a teachable moment.
Sure.
What if we focus more on simply being present, being attentive to the needs around us?
Yeah. It's recognizing that God is already at work in the world, and our role is to join him in that work, not try to outdo him.
And both City Church Georgetown sermons also stress that love, not just hitting quotas or checking boxes, should be the driving force behind evangelism.
Yeah.
Which I thought was a powerful reminder, especially given the eunuch's high social status. He wasn't some project for Philip to take on.
Yeah. He was a person with a genuine thirst for truth.
Yes.
And I think that challenges us to examine our own motivations for outreach. Are we driven by a genuine love for others, or are we more concerned with appearances and numbers?
That's such a good point, because if we're truly operating out of love, it will change how we interact with people, how we listen to them, how we respond to their questions.
Yeah. It's about building authentic relationships, not just winning arguments or converting people to our way of thinking.
Speaking of genuine transformation, the Orchard Church had a really compelling take on the eunuch's immediate baptism. They focused on it as this powerful image of obedience, a physical manifestation of an inward change.
Yeah.
And it made me think, does understanding always precede obedience? Or can the act of obedience itself be a catalyst for deeper understanding?
That's good. I like that.
Like the eunuch's yes to baptism, it was almost like a step of faith, even if he didn't fully grasp all the theological implications.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe there's a lesson there for us as well. How often do we let fear or uncertainty hold us back from taking that next step of faith, even if we don't have all the answers?
Yeah. And this ties in really nicely with Menlo Church's take on the passage. They highlighted the idea that public acts of faith, like baptism, aren't just for us, they bring joy in heaven.
Right.
They even quoted Thomas à Kempis, who said, "Instant obedience is the only kind of obedience there is. Delayed obedience is disobedience."
Oh, that's
heavy.
Yeah, it is. And it makes you think about the ripple effects of our obedience.
Yeah.
It's not just about our personal relationship with God. It's about participating in something much bigger than ourselves.
Right.
It's about joining in the cosmic celebration that happens when someone chooses to follow Christ.
Absolutely.
But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's go back to the eunuch for a moment. Several sermons highlighted his historical context, pointing out that he was likely a God-fearer, meaning he already worshipped the God of Israel.
Right.
And so that detail adds such a fascinating layer to this encounter.
Yeah.
He wasn't a complete stranger to the faith, but he was also likely excluded from fully participating in Jewish religious life.
Because of his position, yeah.
That's right.
So Philip wasn't just sharing the gospel with him. He was offering him a sense of belonging, a place in a community that embraced him for who he was.
Yeah, I love that. That's so good.
Which makes me think about, how we welcome newcomers into our churches and Bible studies today.
Yeah.
Are we creating spaces where people feel seen and accepted and loved, regardless of their background or their level of understanding?
Yeah. And especially when they're coming from different backgrounds, maybe even different faith traditions.
Yeah.
But they're curious about Christianity.
Right.
We can learn a lot from Philip's approach, which wasn't about forcing a theological agenda,
Right.
but about meeting the eunuch where he was at and offering him the good news of Jesus in a way that was relevant to his experience.
That's such a powerful reminder for us because it's easy to get caught up in our own church culture and forget that not everyone comes to the faith with the same background or assumptions. It challenges us to step outside our comfort zones and be willing to engage with people who might be different from us, who might ask different questions, who might have different perspectives.
Absolutely.
Speaking of stepping outside our comfort zones, the Village Beaverton sermon highlighted the Holy Spirit's role in Philip's journey and comparing it to the Great Commission.
Right.
They used this brilliant illustration from Homer's Odyssey to drive home the point that Philip went to the very edges of the known world. Back then, Ethiopians were considered the farthest of men.
Right.
Making this encounter even more significant.
Yeah, the ends of the earth.
The ends of the earth, right. It's almost like Philip was like a first-century missionary, paving the way for the global spread of Christianity.
Absolutely. And isn't that what we're called to do in our own way?
Yeah.
To be those who carry the message of hope and love to the ends of the earth.
Right.
Wherever that may be for us.
To the ends of our earth.
Yeah. Right. It might not be Ethiopia.
But maybe it's that neighborhood we've always avoided, that colleague we've never really connected with, or that family member who seems resistant to faith.
That's good. I like that.
You know?
Yeah.
It's about being open to the Spirit's leading and trusting that God will open doors and create opportunities for us to share His love.
Right.
Even in unexpected places.
Yeah.
But it's not always about grand gestures or far-off journeys, is it? Sometimes it's about those small, everyday acts of obedience.
You're right. And that's where those relatable secular illustrations can be so helpful, right?
Oh, yeah. Like one sermon used the example of a man who felt compelled to leave a generous tip for a thrift store cashier on her birthday, even though he barely knew her.
Yeah.
And another one compared the eunuch's eagerness for baptism to a car salesman who's thrilled to close a deal.
Love it.
Right. Who would have thought car sales and baptism have anything in common? But those seemingly ordinary examples bring the theological concepts to life in a way that's really memorable.
Totally.
Don't you think?
They remind us that faith isn't confined to Sunday mornings or religious settings, right?
Right.
It can show up in the most unexpected places, in the most mundane interactions. It's about being attuned to those moments where God is nudging us to act, to love, to serve, even in seemingly insignificant ways.
It's about recognizing that every encounter, every interaction has the potential to be a divine appointment if we're open to it.
Exactly. It's about being present, being attentive, and being willing to let God use us in ways we might never have imagined. But you know, there's another layer to all of this that we haven't even touched on yet.
Oh, I love where this is going. Lay it on us.
Remember how we talked about the eunuch likely being a God-fearer?
Yeah.
Well, there are some really intriguing questions about what that actually meant for him in that time period.
Yeah, that definitely stood out to me. It's easy to assume he had a full grasp of Jewish theology, but it was probably much more nuanced than that.
Right. And the sermons we looked at didn't really dive into this, but I think it's worth exploring further. You see, God-fearers occupied this fascinating space between Judaism and paganism.
So they weren't fully Jewish, but they weren't fully Gentile either.
Exactly.
That raises all sorts of questions about how they would have understood the concept of a Messiah.
Precisely. And it makes you wonder if Philip had to tailor his message to accommodate the eunuch's unique theological background.
That's a fascinating point. It challenges us to think about how we might need to adapt our approach to sharing the gospel depending on who we're talking to.
Because one size fits all rarely works when it comes to matters of faith.
It's about meeting people where they are, understanding their worldview, and finding common ground from which to build a bridge of understanding. But we'll have to unpack that more in part 2.
Indeed. Welcome back to our deep dive into Acts 8:26-39. You know, as we were prepping for this, I kept thinking about the sheer boldness of Philip's actions.
I know, right? He's basically running alongside a moving chariot. Talk about above and beyond for ministry.
I know. And then he jumps right in with a question that could have easily been perceived as confrontational.
Do you understand what you are reading?
Yeah. But instead of being offended, the eunuch is relieved.
Right.
He admits his confusion and invites Philip into the chariot.
It makes you wonder how often we miss opportunities for connection because we're afraid to ask that simple question.
Exactly. Sometimes people are just waiting for someone to acknowledge their struggle, to give them permission to say, I don't get it.
Yeah, and that vulnerability creates such a powerful opening for authentic dialogue.
It's like Philip connected with the eunuch's heart before even mentioning Jesus.
Yeah.
He met him right where he was, both physically and emotionally.
Which brings us back to that idea of love being the foundation of evangelism.
Hmm.
It's not about forcing our beliefs on others. It's about creating a space where they feel safe enough to explore their own questions and doubts.
Yeah. And that's where the historical context we touched on earlier becomes so crucial. This eunuch, as a God-fearer, already had some understanding of the Jewish faith. But because of his position, he may have felt excluded from fully participating in it.
So Philip wasn't just explaining the gospel. He was offering a sense of belonging, of being welcomed into a community that embraced him for who he was.
And isn't that what we all long for, really? To be seen, accepted, and loved unconditionally.
Absolutely. But let's not gloss over the fact that this encounter wasn't without its challenges. We have to remember the social stigma surrounding eunuchs back then. They were often marginalized and viewed as outsiders.
Which makes the eunuch's eagerness for baptism even more profound. He didn't let societal norms dictate his spiritual journey.
And Philip didn't let those norms dictate his ministry either. He saw a person, not a label.
It's a powerful reminder that the gospel transcends cultural boundaries and societal expectations.
Yeah, speaking of transcending boundaries, I loved how Village Beaverton connected this story to the Great Commission, emphasizing that the gospel is meant to reach the ends of the earth.
Yeah, and their use of Homer's Odyssey to illustrate how Ethiopians were considered the farthest of men in ancient times was just brilliant.
You think that?
It adds a whole new layer of meaning to that phrase, ends of the earth.
It's almost like Philip was like a proto-missionary, paving the way for the global spread of Christianity.
Right.
And it challenges us to consider how we might be called to be missionaries in our own contexts, whether that's across the globe or across the street. It's about being open to the Spirit's leading, even if it takes us to unexpected places or puts us in contact with people who are different from us.
And that openness often requires us to confront our own biases and assumptions.
Which can be uncomfortable for sure.
Definitely. But growth rarely happens within our comfort zones.
So true. And the sermons we looked at offered some great illustrations to help bridge that gap between theory and practice.
Like that story of the man who felt led to leave a generous tip for the thrift store cashier on her birthday. It's such a simple act, but it speaks volumes about being attuned to the needs of those around us.
Right.
Yeah.
And the analogy of the car salesman eager to close a deal was such a perfect way to capture the eunuch's enthusiasm for baptism.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that sometimes people are ready and waiting for what we have to offer.
But we have to be willing to meet them where they are, to speak their language, and to create a space where they feel safe enough to say yes.
Which brings us back to the importance of love, doesn't it? Love that listens, love that empathizes, love that meets needs without judgment or expectation.
It's the kind of love that Philip modeled for us in his encounter with the Ethiopian eunuch.
And it's the kind of love that we're called to embody as we live out our own faith in the world.
But, let's circle back for a moment to that point about the eunuch likely being a God-fearer.
Yeah.
There are some fascinating implications there that we could unpack further for our listeners.
You mean about how that might have impacted his understanding of what Philip was teaching him?
Exactly. We talked about how God-fearers occupy this in-between space, not fully Jewish or Gentile. And some scholars suggest they might have held different messianic expectations than the Jews of that time.
So their understanding of who the Messiah was and what he would do might have been quite different.
Precisely. And that raises a fascinating question. Did Philip have to adjust his approach to sharing the gospel based on the eunuch's unique background?
That's a really thought-provoking question for pastors and Bible study leaders. It suggests that effective ministry requires us to be aware of and sensitive to the different theological frameworks people might be bringing to the table.
It's a reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to sharing the gospel.
Right.
We need to be able to meet people where they are, to understand their questions and assumptions, and to tailor our message in a way that resonates with their hearts and minds.
I think that's such a critical point, especially in today's world where we encounter people from such diverse backgrounds and belief systems.
It requires us to be students, not just teachers, to be listeners, not just lecturers, to be humble enough to admit that we don't have all the answers and that we can learn something from everyone we encounter.
And that's the challenge worth wrestling with. But before we move on to part 3, I want to pose a question to our listeners, something to really chew on.
Ooh, I love a good cliffhanger.
Imagine you're in Philip's sandals, running alongside that chariot.
Okay.
The eunuch has invited you in, he's eager to learn, but he's coming from a completely different cultural and religious background.
Hmm.
How do you approach that conversation? Where do you even begin?
That's a great question to reflect on. It really pushes us to step outside our own comfortable assumptions and try to see the world through the eyes of someone who might be very different from us.
It reminds us that evangelism isn't about following a script or reciting a set of doctrines. It's about being led by the Spirit and being responsive to the unique needs of each individual we encounter.
And sometimes that means being willing to step out in faith, even when we don't have all the answers, trusting that God will guide us and equip us for the task at hand.
We'll be back in part 3 to explore even more insights from this amazing passage in Acts. Welcome back to our final part of this deep dive into Acts 8:26-39. I'm still thinking about that question we left off with last time.
Oh, yeah, me too.
It's just such a powerful image, putting ourselves in Philip's sandals, running alongside that chariot, about to have a conversation with someone who comes from a completely different background, a completely different world.
Yeah, it really gets to the heart of what it means to be a disciple, to be willing to step outside of our comfort zones, engage with people who are different from us, do so with humility and recognizing we don't have all the answers, and trusting that the Spirit's going to guide us.
Absolutely. And that leads us back to one of the most striking parts in this passage, which is the eunuch's immediate request for baptism.
Yeah?
There's no hesitation. There's no long theological debate.
Yeah.
He just hears the good news and he's ready to jump in.
Yeah.
Literally.
It's almost like, his understanding of Jesus, while maybe not fully formed, was enough to compel him to take this radical step.
Right.
And we don't see Philip giving him a lengthy theological lecture beforehand, do we?
No, not at all.
There's no catechism, no list of doctrines to memorize.
Yeah.
It seems like the eunuch's encounter with Jesus, however incomplete, was enough to spark this incredible act of faith. And that's pretty challenging to how we often approach evangelism.
That is a good point. I know.
Yeah.
Sometimes we can get so focused on intellectual assent to these certain doctrines,
Yeah,
but sometimes it's the heart that leads the way.
for sure. It's about encountering Jesus in a personal, transformative way, even if we don't have all the theological pieces perfectly lined up.
Mhm.
And that brings us back to the importance of creating space for mystery and wonder in our faith. It's not about having all the answers neatly packaged, right?
Right.
It's about being open to the ongoing revelation of God's truth in our lives and in the lives of others.
But let's not overlook the powerful symbolism of baptism itself. The Orchard Church called it an outward sign of an inward transformation.
Right.
And I think that's a beautiful way to put it.
Absolutely. It's a physical embodiment of our death to sin and resurrection to new life in Christ. Public declaration of our commitment to follow Jesus no matter the cost.
And in the eunuch's case, that commitment was likely met with opposition and persecution when he returned to his own culture.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. He was returning to a culture that probably didn't embrace his newfound faith. So baptism wasn't just a symbolic gesture for him. It was a courageous act of defiance.
Yeah.
A declaration that his allegiance was now to Christ, even if it meant facing rejection and isolation from everyone he knew. And that's really what we're called to do as well, isn't it?
Yeah, to stand firm in our faith, even when it's unpopular, even when it costs us something.
To be willing to swim against the tide, trusting that God's grace will sustain us.
It's hard, though. I mean, we all need those reminders. We need encouragement. We need to hear stories of faith that inspire us to keep going.
And that's what makes the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch so powerful. It's a testament to the transformative power of the gospel, the boldness of the Spirit, and the courage of those who dare to say yes to Jesus.
It challenges us to rethink our assumptions, to step outside of our comfort zones, and to embrace those unexpected ways that God might be calling us to join him in his mission.
And as we conclude this deep dive, I just want to encourage you to reflect on what has resonated with you most from this conversation. What insights will you carry with you? What questions will you continue to wrestle with?
And remember, this isn't just about accumulating knowledge. It's about allowing the truth of Scripture to transform our hearts and shape our actions in the world.
May we all be as open to the Spirit's leading as Philip was, as eager to learn as that eunuch was, and as courageous in our faith as they both were.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope that it's been a source of encouragement and inspiration to you for your ministry.